As a mid-40-year-old American, one of the things that I never thought I would see would be an assault upon the rights of the people to speak freely about politics or the things that are on their mind. It felt nearly sacred. Americans have always spoken their minds, and all people in the country, short of the most radical, held firmly to the belief that this was how society functions. They may not like what is being said, but they understood that tolerating that speech also gave them the same rights to speak up on their thoughts. They understood it to be a bedrock piece of the American experience. This wasn't a Democratic or Republican issue generally. It was something that could be said to be a piece of the cultural fabric that made Americans, Americans. Certainly, governments and power are always trying their best to silence people, especially when it doesn't support their narrative. The anti-war crowd or the Occupy Wall Street protesters certainly felt some of that attempted oppression by the government. But for the most part, Americans held that those people had a deeply held right to protest and speak up against those issues that they felt strongly about. Uniquely, the 21st century saw two simultaneous strands develop in relationship to free speech. At first, these strands were antithetical to each other, but as time went by, they found themselves in a Clinton-style marriage of mutual benefit, where one gained wealth and market share of everything, and the other co-opted a trust that they had not earned in order to control the narratives of the world. When the 90s unleashed this grand idea of instantaneous information upon the world through the internet, there was a rush of people who flocked to it and found a home in the frontier of newness. The internet was initially the Wild West of speech, where you could find nearly anything you wanted to read about by almost any niche commentator. People were writing and blogging and recording videos where a diverse range of opinions could be found. Some of them were outlandish, some of them were wrong, but for the most part it was a fantastic marketplace of ideas that enabled the citizen to listen, absorb, and distill ideas down into the closest proximity of truth the mind could ascertain. The only problem with it was that it was cumbersome to do. Creating a website was expensive and required the local nerds from the digital dungeon to help you make it. They knew the language and were the gatekeepers by shrouding that language in complexity. The second strand was the surveillance state that ratcheted itself up into the stratosphere after the attacks of 9/11. The government felt a need, perhaps in altruism, but more likely in glee, that the citizens were too hard to control and the world was too dangerous for anything other than the absolute management of everything. The internet was a tool that was too free and unwieldy for them, and it needed management. The internet created a public square where the actions of government could be questioned, their war machine could be examined, and their deceit of the American public would be exposed. These two changes in our culture were incongruent at first, seeming to be competitors for a vision of the future. One, a free range of ideas and exposure, and another of top-down management that would make blandness of thought the highest ideal. There was a punk rock spirit to the original internet. It was the place that was going to give everyone the life of liberation that once could only be dreamt about. The surveillance state, as contrasted, was covered in Orwell, where everything was watched and the people were the impedance to a grand future of control. Then along came Google and Facebook, two easy platforms to accomplish what had long been a struggle for most. With a few clicks, you could have your own website or find anything you wanted. It was easy to use, and it exploded. Billions of people flocked to their sites and became users. Now you could connect with long-lost friends, see grandma's new kitten, or what your favorite celeb du jour was eating for dinner at Spago. It consolidated the Wild West and made the platform the place to congregate in the town square. The clunky, site counter counting, unaesthetic websites that Jimbo your neighbor had made were made almost obsolete overnight. Finding things became easier too. Google was simple and reliable. Search became broad and accurate. You could find your strange laser pen you had driven all over town looking for and ultimately attempted to build from parts at Radio Shack in just a few clicks. The platform, through their ease of use, built trust with the public and quickly vanquished the competition. If a new platform rose to prominence, Google or Facebook acquired them for ungodly sums of money, so much money that their creators could not turn it down. And sooner than later, every great idea was suddenly owned by Alphabet or Meta. Apple made the interface through applications on their revolutionary and elegant phone, Amazon made everything easy to buy, and the whole tech machine had more money and influence than the world had ever seen before. It was really fantastic at first. Everything seemed easier and more efficient. Travel became possible at any time because everything was at your fingertips. You could get your email, text messages, or do work on applications from your phone or tablet from the beach in Kiribati, and no one would know the difference. It felt liberating and very American. Efficiency and affluence were at peak experience. The The tech companies kept developing better tools and earning our trust with their American business awesomeness. There was an application for every problem one could dream up, and everything from math to finding restaurants was conveniently at your fingertips. It was a fabulous moment. As in most things, the more the tech companies became consolidated, the more the government wanted a piece of the action. They felt their urges to be involved and controlling go haywire. People were moving more freely, exchanging in commerce more readily, and were doing it with tools that had been developed in the private sector. There was a new frontier being created, and the government was being left out. So the government began to offer contracts for their needs: defense data storage, NSA cloud services, and other government-oriented, super-secret James Bond-esque contracts that paid overly well and required oversight by the bureaucratic state, and they were too tempting to pass up for the tech companies. Simultaneously, as the tech companies grew into unimaginably sized behemoths because of their products and the newfound government contracts, the people started to realize that these companies were gravitating to the worst sides of capitalism and using their size and wealth to smash and vacate their competitors. In nearly every chance they had, they took advantage of their situation and would do everything in their power to vanquish anyone with a better idea or way of content curation. The pattern was predictable. If the idea was good, the tech companies would buy it, absorb it, and send the creators off into a cash-covered sunset. If the ideas were threatening, they would shadow it away from their platforms and make it impossible to get exposure. When advertising hit the platforms, the small maker, creator, media outlets all were cooked geese. The real estate was owned by the platforms, and you had to either pay to play or go out of business. The complaints from the people came, and governments used their trusted position of the hall monitor to bring the tech bros up to Washington to fire their warning shots across the bow. Behave and get in line, or we can make your life a miserable hell. So the tech folks dutifully complied and snuck straight into the bed the government was offering. And all of this happened in the dawn hours before the virus. Tech was fully complicit with government, and the people trusted tech because of what they provided. When the wet market killer from Wuhan was unleashed on the world, this corporate marriage of tech and state kicked into high gear, and together they used one another as the convenient excuses to stifle nearly every right that Americans took for granted, but especially the right to speak freely without government chilling or threatening that speech. It was imperative for the public good, they said, to make sure that all of us got the best information. The public initially trusted all of it. The government was there to protect, and the tech companies were along for the ride to help us all get that information as efficiently and elegantly as they always had. But just as thin as the plausibility of bat soup being the culprit for this authoritarian moment, the veiled sinisterness of the government came to light, and they had the perfect moment they needed to accomplish that long-held goal of control over the citizen. And they had the perfect vehicle that nearly every American was now addicted to do it. The messages came quickly and with orchestrated smoothness. Within mere moments, the people were along for the lockstep march into top-down managed control by the authorities. The cacophony of moderated messages and propagandized methodologies were loud and standardized, and the people were abused of their trust. There were movements of people who saw through it and were skeptical of what was happening. They even spoke up initially. And had the platforms been unavailable, and they were still on the homemade basement versions of their websites, they would have been able to continue to speak up. Good scientists started to do actual science and ask questions about the protocols for treatment. There were researchers on the front lines of the pandemic, and they were saying the numbers didn't add up, and there was a better way to handle the dangers besides destroy an economy and lock everyone in their houses. Doctors like Vladimir Zelenko, who created protocols for treatments, and others who discussed hydroxychloroquine, were quickly absconded and tossed to the side. They didn't meet the goal of creating panic and demands for a vaccine at fevered pitch. Others who wrote scientific papers like Dr. J. Bhattacharya and his co-authors of the Great Barrington Declaration were dismissed as anti-science and silenced. But this time, the silencing was unique in history. It wasn't just the media that was attempting to control the narrative. It was the government putting pressure upon the once trusted tech platforms to help in the silencing. This once Wild West avenue of guerrillaizing information dissemination was now under pressure from the government to silence anything that didn't support their desired pathway forward. It happened in an instant, and the real scientific process was squashed and squeezed away by threat. Good people in the press were also the victims of dark collusion. People who spoke up in question were spoken of as kooks and cranks, and their social media platforms that they had used without troubles in the past were suddenly unable to spread their words and questions about the moment because they were shut down and shadow banned. People like Joe Rogan, a podcaster with the largest audience in the world, were impugned and maligned for suggesting that people consider something besides the industrial version of medicine. Authors and commentators like Mark Steyn were vanquished and removed from their television shows for violating community trust by showing that there were people injured and dying from the rushed medical vaccines. Robert Kennedy Jr., who was right from the very beginning about how the government was going to approach this with authoritarian instincts, had all of his accounts locked, and he was silenced because his facts were inconvenient to the government. The authoritarian powers managed to gain control over everything that mattered. If you built an app that offered alternative information, the Apple Store would remove it. If you had alternative ideas on how the pandemic should be approached, Google buried it. If you had the state come to the door of your small business with guns and threats, and you posted the video of it to Facebook, they disallowed it. If you wanted to donate to a peaceful protest of truckers in Ottawa, PayPal and Stripe could freeze it, and the governments confiscate your bank accounts. Free speech was murdered in a coup, orchestrated and celebrated by the most powerful. Free speech is the cornerstone of what makes a functioning society work. Ideas create the atmosphere for a civilization to function without violence. When people can speak their minds, they harbor less resentment and turn to peaceful solutions for their grievances. In the world the modern governments are creating, the outcome has no choice but to bend towards a violent end. Extremism is the byproduct of authoritarianism. At no time in history has that stifling of the people resulted in a utopian panacea through that totalitarian control. Instead, it usually results in death and war and misery. Free speech is the only path out of this moment. We need more voices, not less. We need more bold people like Rogan and Stein and Kennedy to keep speaking up when the governments insist they should not. We need more scientists like Bhattacharya, Zelenko, and McCullough to tell the world about the real results of real scientific research. They need to be the counterweight to the Fauci characters in the government theater. This is a critical moment in our world. Western society truly hangs on the balance of how we treat our free ability at speaking. If we lose that, the dark ages will be upon us, foisted on the world like strange scenes from White Noise and A Brave New World. We will live in a wild tech prison where we won't know if it's raining unless the device in our pocket tells us it is, and we survive our disillusionment with this by numbing all of our inclinations towards our soul cries of liberty with whatever street-laced kerosene soma is available.